Alright, hello 7th grade. So today we're looking at biased and unbiased samples. And so far with our graphs and our charts and our percentages and stuff, we've been assuming that those samples are coming from unbiased samples. So in general, what unbiased means is that it's an accurate representation of the group that we're taking a sample of. And if something is biased, there's something either in our method for choosing people or in the way we ask the question or something else that's skewing our results one way or the other, so it's not an accurate representation of the group we're getting a sample of. So first thing we're going to take a look at is some different methods for getting a sample. And a simple random sample is what you generally think of when you think of a sample. You're drawing names out of a hat or picking people in some other random way. So if I wanted to get a sample out of your class and I drew some names out of a hat, that would be a good way to get a sample. Now, a class your size, I could just ask everybody. But if you had a class of, say, 100 or 1,000 people, you might not want to ask everybody. So if I wanted a simple random sample, we're drawing names or picking people at random. And if you're doing this with a bigger survey, you're probably not drawing names out of a physical hat. You're programming a computer to do that for you or something. But in general, that's a good way to get a sample. Now, that by itself does not mean that our sample is unbiased, but as far as our method of getting a sample, yeah, that gets a check. A systematic random sample is like if I go through and pick every 5th person or every 10th person. So if I go through and list all your names out alphabetically and I pick every 5th person on the list or every 10th person or every 20th person on the list, depending on how long a list I have, that's a systematic random sample. So I'm picking people using intervals. So every 5th person, or every 10th person, or every 100th person. So it's still random, I'm still getting a random sample, but there's a method to it, so I'm not having to physically draw names out of a hat or something. I can just make a list and check off every 5th name. Okay, and in general, that's also a pretty good way to get a sample. Alright. A convenience sample is when you ask the people who are the easiest to get. For example, if I wanted to know something about the high school and I asked your class, because that happened to be the class I was in at the moment. Or if you were or if you had a poll on Facebook, you get a convenience sample of the people who wanted to respond to that poll. So any convenient sample is anyone handy. So anyone who happens to be nearby. And depending on where you are, that could either be good or that could be a little bit of a red flag there about whether our survey is accurate or not. So it depends on what kind of group you want to say something about. So if I asked 7th grade, because that happened to be the class I was in at the moment, and I wanted to use that as a result to say something about the 7th grade, okay, that's probably pretty accurate. But if I wanted to use it to say something about the whole high school, or the high school and the elementary school, asking just the 7th grade's probably not a great idea. I'm going to move my cat. So a convenient sample is exactly what it sounds like. It's convenient, but it might not be the most accurate way to get a sample, depending on the kind of group you want to use it to say something about. Same sort of thing with a voluntary response. So a voluntary response is when you just leave it open for anyone to answer if they want to. For example, if I put a sign up in the hallway that said, "Do you like cats or dogs better?" And anyone who walked by could just write whether they like cats or dogs better. They volunteered to give their response. So a voluntary response is people can choose whether to answer. Which is also another way you could categorize that Facebook thing. So people are choosing whether or not to answer your Facebook poll. You're not going up to them and saying, you have to answer this. So in general, that's going to be another thing that gets a question mark, again, depending on what kind of group you want to use that to say something about. Now, another place you'll get a voluntary response is like if you're looking on Amazon and you're looking at reviews for something. People choose whether or not to leave that review. And, I mean, just having a little question mark doesn't mean that that's not useful information, but if you ask a question like that, you're going to get responses from people who generally have a strong opinion one way or the other. Which is why if you're looking at reviews for a product, you'll generally either see a lot of high scores or a lot of low scores. You won't see a lot in that mid-range, because in general, if people thought it was okay, they're probably not going to give a strong opinion on a survey. They're not going to bother taking the time to fill that out because they didn't feel strongly one way or the other. So it's not useless information, but it's a good thing to keep in mind that you're only getting responses from people who have a strong opinion about whatever that thing is. Okay. Couple other things to keep in mind regardless of how it is that you're getting your sample, and the first thing is, did we ask enough people for this to be representative? For example, even if I'm using a completely random survey and drawing names out of a hat, I still want to make sure that I get enough. Like if I had your class and I drew 2 names out of a hat and asked you what your favorite animal was, and out of those 2 people, one person said cat, and I got one person who said a unicorn. And I want to say, well, okay, so 50% of people like cats, 50% of people like unicorns. Well, no, probably not. We probably didn't ask enough people there. So you want to make sure you're getting enough that you're getting a good sample of whatever population. So if I wanted to ask people in the high school, maybe like 20-25% would give me a good sample of the high school, 1 in 5 or 1 out of 4. So if I asked every 4th person in the high school, that would give me a better idea of what's going on than if I just asked 3 or 4 of you. Now, obviously, there's a trade-off. Obviously, the best way to get a sample would be to ask everybody, but in general, you probably don't want to do that unless your sample of people is pretty small. So, I could ask everybody in your class. But if I wanted to get a good sample of people in South Dakota, I don't want to go through and ask however many hundreds of thousands of people live in South Dakota, whatever my question is. No, I want enough of a sample to be sure that I'm getting a good representation, but you generally don't want to go through and ask everybody unless you're trying to get a sample from a small enough population to begin with. So, there's a trade-off there. More people is generally better. But there's a trade-off that more people is also more work. Okay, and then the other thing you want to look at is whether the people we asked are a representative sample of people as a whole, which is what I was talking about earlier with like your class and the entire school. So if I asked your class whether you were planning on going to the dance, and I concluded that, let's say 50% of you said you were going to the dance, and I concluded that 50% of the high school was going to the dance. Well, maybe. Or maybe the 7th graders are more likely to go to the dance. And they're certainly more likely to go to the dance than kindergartners who aren't allowed to go to the dance in the first place. So I want to be careful and make sure that the population we're taking our sample from matches the population we want to say something about. So if I asked, for example, what your favorite football team was, if I asked your class, and say 60% of you said the Vikings, I could probably use that to conclude that about 60% of the high school likes the Vikings. I'm using the Vikings as an example because I'm a Vikings fan. But you probably don't want to use that to say something about, say, the country as a whole. Because in general, if we're in South Dakota, you're going to get a lot of what? You're going to get a lot of Vikings fans, you're going to get some Broncos fans, you might get some Packers fans, but that's pretty much it for the state. Now watch out in the comments, there's probably some team that I forgot that you get a lot of around here, but you're probably not going to get a whole lot of, say, Patriots fans, or Seahawks fans, or something that's not geographically close to South Dakota. So if you want to use that to say, it's like 60% of people in South Dakota are such and such fans, okay, maybe. But if you want to use it to say something about the country as a whole, probably not. There are probably a disproportionate number of Vikings fans in South Dakota, or especially if you did the same thing in Minnesota. So you want to make sure the population you're getting your sample from matches the population you want to say something about. Shoe cat. Sitting on that now that's smudged. Okay, so what we've got here is we've got some examples, and we want to figure out, is this a valid conclusion? Is this something we can say from the population that we've got? So Amy asked all the seniors in trigonometry what their favorite subject was, and 16 out of 20 said math. So Amy concludes that 80% of her high school likes math best. Now, if you're just looking at the numbers and going, well, 16 out of 20, yeah, that's 8 out of 10, that's 80%, right? Okay, but who did she ask? If she asked seniors in trigonometry, in general, if you're taking math as a senior, you probably like math. Because we only have 3 years of math that are required to graduate, so if you're still taking it as a senior, you probably have a higher percentage than normal of people who like math. So if you want to figure out how many people in the high school like math as their favorite subject, seniors who are taking a senior math class that's optional might not be your best pick. You definitely want to ask some of them, but you probably want to ask some other people too. So this is probably a rather biased sample. If it's biased, we want to know, okay, well, what can we do to make it better? So if I want to ask somebody besides seniors in trigonometry, okay, who could I ask instead that would get me a better sample than seniors in trig? And this is where I would wait for your answers normally, but in general, you want to make sure you're getting a good sample of the whole high school, because that's what we want to say something about. So if we want to conclude something about the high school in general, we want to make sure that we're asking a representative sample. So let's say instead of trig, well, first of all, let's say instead of seniors, Amy asked, let's say 1 out of every 5 high schoolers. And I just picked 1 out of every 5 because if there are 20 people in math class, then 1 out of 5 would give you 4. That's probably a reasonable number of people to ask. So 1 out of every 5, and we want to make sure we say high school students rather than just people who are taking trig. So if I want to say something about high school students, I want to make sure I'm asking a good enough sample of high school students in general, not just one class. So the way it was biased. Here's something we could do to make it better. Now, is it going to make it perfect? But it'll definitely make it better than it was. Okay, Raj, you gotta get off that now. And that's when it's smudged. Okay, similar idea here. So Bob asked every 5th person in the school cafeteria whether they're going to the basketball game. 11 out of 25 people said yes. So Bob concludes that about 45% or 44% of the school will be there. Okay, and again, if we're looking at the numbers, okay, well, 11 out of 25, yeah, that gives me 0.44 if you divide that. So yeah, that's 44%, so the numbers check out. And now I just want to know, is this a good sample? So if he's asking every 5th person, that's a systematic random. So that gets a check. And then every 5th person, yeah, that's probably a big enough sample size, assuming, maybe 100 people in the high school. Every 5th person, that gets you 20% of a sample. Yeah, we're in the right range. And then we want to look at where he asked them, okay, the school cafeteria. That's a place where most people in the high school are probably going to be during lunch. Yeah, we should probably include during lunch there. Not people are just randomly hanging out in the cafeteria. So if you ask people during lunch, yeah, the cafeteria is where most of your people are going to be. You're going to get a pretty good sample, so I would call this valid. That gets a stamp. So that's a pretty good way to get a sample. Now, there are still questions you could ask, like, okay, well, how many people are really in the school cafeteria, or are more people going and eating lunch somewhere else? But in general, this is probably a pretty valid survey. Okay, one more of these. So we got Chris. And Chris, that got smudged there when my cat sat on it. Sorry about that. So Chris is asking his friends on Facebook what their favorite baseball team is. 75% of them prefer the Twins, so Chris concludes that most people are Twins fans. 75%, that's most, right? But who's he asking? He's asking his friends on Facebook. So anytime you have a Facebook survey or a survey that's online, what you're getting is a voluntary response. Which, again, isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, but we do want to make sure that we're using this to say something that's accurate for the sample that we're actually getting. So if Chris is asking his friends on Facebook and concluding something about most people in general, probably not. Because in general, if you're asking your friends on Facebook about something, you're going to get people who have similar opinions to you, people who are in the same general age range as you. I mean, most of you probably don't have 40, 50-year-olds as friends on Facebook unless they're your parents' friends or something. Do you guys even have Facebook? Okay, anyway. So, in general, if you're asking your friends about something, you're going to get ideas about sports and stuff that are probably pretty similar to yours, especially if most of your friends live in the same area as you. So if Chris lives in a place where there are lots of Twins fans, a lot of his friends are also going to be Twins fans. So if we wanted to make this better or use this to say something a bit more accurate, instead of concluding that most people are Twins fans, because that's probably not a safe thing to say about most people in general just from this survey, but you could say that most of Chris's friends are Twins fans. Although it would probably be more accurate, again, with the voluntary response thing, if you're asking people what their favorite baseball team is, you're probably only going to get responses from people who like baseball in the first place. So if we want to be even more accurate, we could say most of Chris's friends who like baseball are Twins fans. Alright, so that's a more accurate thing to say with the information that we got, because Chris sampled his friends. Which isn't a bad thing. I mean, especially if you're just doing this for fun on Facebook. I don't want to say that that's a bad thing. It's just you want to use it to say something that's representative of the same sample that you're getting your answers from. So if Chris is asking his friends, sure, he can use it to say that about his friends in general, especially the ones who like baseball. But you probably don't want to use it to say something about all of the United States or all of the world, because it probably wouldn't be accurate to say that 75% of the country is Twins fans. I don't know. Did they have a really good season last year? I don't think they did. Anyway, so that's what's going on. So on the homework, if it's something that's a biased sample, you want to suggest a way to make it better. So what are some things that would make this a more accurate sample? And you're never going to get a survey that's absolutely perfect, but there are always things that we could do to make it better. So go ahead and check out the homework in the description below, and I'll see you in the next video.